The air left my lungs so fast it felt like someone had driven a fist straight through my ribs. My mother's hand, manicured and steady, slid a brass carrying across the polished walnut conference table until it stopped against my notebook with a soft metallic clink. The fluorescent lighting above us bleached every face in that boardroom flat and hard, turning skin waxy, making the framed architectural renderings on the walls shine like wet glass. Daniel stood at the far end of the table with one palm braced on the leather chair in front of him, chin raised, jaw flexing. My father sat beside him with both hands clasped so tightly over his silver pen that his knuckles had gone the color of paper. Melissa Grant from HR hovered near the door with a folder pressed to her chest. Our family attorney, Scott Baines, kept adjusting his tie and avoiding my eyes. Then my mother looked right at me and said, in the same tone she used when she discussed floral centerpieces or charity seating charts, "Your brother deserves it. The house, the reserve account, the company. You've taken enough." Daniel dropped a stack of glossy printouts onto the table. "And, before you start lying, we found the transfers. My name is Elena Marlowe. I'm 34. And this is the story of how I let my family believe they had stripped me of everything, then took back my life so completely that they were left fighting over the wreckage they built for themselves." The photographs fanned out between us. Bank statements, invoice approvals, screenshots of wire confirmations with my login stamped at the top in neat black text. My own name looked obscene there, repeated over and over like graffiti on a church wall. Melissa finally found her voice and said, "We also have statements from 2 staff members confirming unusual financial behavior." "Unusual," I repeated evenly. Daniel gave a short laugh and pushed off the chair. He was wearing the navy suit he reserved for investor dinners, the one that made him think he looked older, sharper, more like our father in his prime. Instead, at that moment, he looked like a man performing adulthood from memory. "Don't do that calm thing, Elena. Not today." My mother folded her hands over her cream silk blouse. Her wedding ring flashed beneath the fluorescent light like a warning beacon. "We tried to handle this privately. You ambushed me at 10 in the morning with HR and counsel," I said. "That's an interesting definition of private." Scott cleared his throat. "Elena, if you cooperate, this can remain a family matter." There it was. The first lie dressed as mercy. I looked from face to face and saw the choreography of it. My mother sitting upright, spine straight as a ruler, as if posture could make cruelty look principled. My father refusing to meet my eyes, the tendon in his temple ticking. Daniel too animated by half, fingers drumming, shoulders high, excitement leaking out of him in bursts. Melissa standing so still she looked pinned in place. They had rehearsed this. Maybe not every word, but the broad strokes. The accusation, the disgust, the magnanimous offer to let me leave quietly. Daniel planted both palms on the table and leaned toward me. "You moved company funds through shell vendors. You signed off on fake renovation expenses for the Chestnut Hill property. You funneled money to personal accounts and thought nobody would notice because Dad trusted you." My father flinched at that last line, but he didn't correct him. Outside the boardroom's glass wall, I could see the open office beyond it. Polished concrete floors, matte black desks, pendant lights hanging like dark bells over the collaborative area. A few employees had slowed near the reception corridor. Not close enough to hear every word. Close enough to know something spectacular was happening. Good, I thought. My mother reached into her structured leather handbag and placed a second item on the table, a slim envelope thick with documents. "This is the severance agreement. You'll resign your officer position. You'll surrender your shares. You'll vacate the company apartment over the carriage house by Friday. The family home transfer closes at noon, and Daniel takes over as CEO effective immediately." Daniel smiled without warmth. "It's done." I looked at the brass carrying again. I recognized it instantly. The front door key to Hawthorne House in Chestnut Hill, the old stone property our grandparents bought in 1978. The library key. The side gate key. My grandfather had handed that ring to me when I was 16 and told me that if I learned the business, really learned it, one day I'd have stewardship of both the house and the company because I understood what those things meant. He'd been dead 8 years. Apparently promises had a shorter shelf life than silverware in my family. You're saying I stole from the company, I said. So, your solution is to give the company to Daniel. He's your brother, my mother snapped. He has a family future to think about. Daniel didn't even have a dog, let alone a family. But in her mouth, future always meant him. Melissa stepped forward and slid the severance packet closer to me. Her hand was trembling. If you sign today, there won't be a criminal referral. Melissa, I said quietly, did you read any of this before you brought it in here? She froze. Daniel cut in fast. Don't drag staff into this. This is about you. No, I said, still looking at Melissa. This is about whoever was desperate enough to stage a boardroom execution at 10 in the morning instead of waiting for a forensic audit. The silence that followed was sharp and clean. My father finally raised his eyes. Just for a second. Long enough for me to see it there. Not guilt. Fear. Daniel recovered first. We have the evidence. You have printouts. My mother made a sound of disbelief. Elena, stop insulting us. I sat back in the leather chair and folded my hands over my notebook. My pulse had slowed. That was always the tell. The calmer I became, the worse it was for the person across from me. Daniel knew that. He'd known it since we were children, and he'd come at me swinging while I waited for him to exhaust himself. He jabbed a finger at the pages. Your login, your approvals, your password, your signature. My signature pasted onto PDF exports, I said. Scott shifted. Excuse me? I turned to him. Did nobody tell you to zoom in? Daniel's mouth tightened. This isn't a courtroom. No, I said. Not yet. My mother's nostrils flared. She leaned forward, elbows now on the walnut table, composure cracking around the edges. Do not threaten us in our own office. I almost smiled at that. Our office. As if the years I spent keeping this company solvent, negotiating vendor contracts at midnight, rebuilding client trust after Daniel's mistakes, and sleeping on the carriage house sofa during the Street Alban renovation had counted for nothing because the woman saying it happened to share my blood. Daniel shoved one last page toward me. You were caught. Just admit it. I picked up the page between two fingers. The paper was warm from the printer. Cheap stock. Last minute. The transfer date at the bottom stared up at me. 11:43 p.m., 2 Thursdays ago. A transfer I had already copied, traced, cross-referenced, and sent to my attorney 19 days earlier. I set it back down. Then I reached into my bag, took out a stainless steel water bottle, unscrewed the cap, and took a slow sip while all of them watched me. Daniel laughed once, too loudly. Are you serious? Yes, I said, recapping the bottle. I am. My mother blinked. My father's shoulders dropped a fraction. Scott's eyes narrowed for the first time. Melissa looked like she wanted the floor to open. I slid my notebook closed and stood. Do not delete anything. Not emails, not text messages, not server logs, not home accounting records, and not the transfer file for Hawthorne House. Daniel straightened. You don't give orders here. I picked up the brass keys and placed them gently back in front of my mother. You can keep them until noon, I said calmly. After that, I'd advise you to have someone available to answer a few urgent questions. I walked out before any of them could stop me. Behind me, Daniel called my name, sharp and angry, and my mother said, Elena, get back in here right now. But I didn't turn around. Their voices followed me down the corridor, thin and frantic under the white office lighting, while employees pretended not to stare. My heels struck the polished concrete floor like a metronome. By the time I reached the elevator, my phone was already vibrating in my hand. Miriam Vale. I let it ring once more before answering. I've just been fired, I said. Miriam's voice stayed level. Did they use the packet we expected? Yes. Did they mention the house transfer? Yes. Good, she said. Come straight to my office. The elevator doors opened with a soft hydraulic sigh. I stepped inside alone, watched the reflection of my face in the brushed steel walls, and felt the day shift under my feet. Daniel thought he had cornered me. My mother thought she had made a hard but necessary choice. My father thought silence would protect him the way it always had. They thought they had thrown me out with a cardboard box and a threat. They had no idea I'd spent the last 3 months documenting every nail in the trap they built. 3 months earlier, I was standing in the secondary kitchen at Hawthorne House under warm recessed lighting, signing off on catering numbers for my mother's fall donor dinner, when I noticed a liquor invoice that made no sense. The granite island was covered in linen swatches, guest cards, and silver tasting spoons. My mother was at the opposite end dictating centerpiece revisions into her phone. Daniel wandered in late, smelling like expensive cologne and somebody else's perfume, and grabbed a sparkling water from the Sub-Zero fridge without asking how preparations were going. That was Daniel's gift. He moved through the work other people were doing as if it had formed naturally around him. The invoice sat in my inbox under the heading Stonebridge Materials, Rush Approval. Stonebridge was a dormant vendor. We'd used them once, years ago, for reclaimed oak flooring on a boutique hotel project in Newport. The new invoice referenced site stabilization consultations for Hawthorne House. There was no stabilization project. There was no signed scope. There wasn't even a current vendor agreement. I called down the hall to ask Daniel if he knew anything about it. He leaned in the doorway with one shoulder against the frame, rolling the bottle between his palms. Dad asked me to get ahead of some repairs. What repairs? The kind rich people pay for before they admit the walls are cracking. That isn't an answer. He smiled like he was indulging a child. Then don't approve it. Except the invoice had already been stamped approved in the system, under my credentials. That stopped me cold. I didn't react. Not outwardly. I clicked through the back-end logs instead. 2 things became obvious almost immediately. First, the approval had been processed from an internal IP address tied to Daniel's office desktop. Second, the login occurred at 11:47 p.m. the night before, while I was on a delayed Amtrak back from Washington after meeting with the Armitage Hotel Group. I still had the train receipt, the time-stamped presentation, the dinner charge from Union Station, and a photo Miriam later joked was my accidental alibi because it showed me half asleep against the window with the exact time visible on the seatback display.
I should have called it out then.
Any normal person would have, but normal behavior only works on people acting in good faith. By that point, the pattern had already started to hum beneath the surface of everything. Daniel asking strange questions about account permissions. My mother wanting an updated valuation of Hawthorne House for estate planning. My father canceling 2 one-on-one meetings with me, then suddenly asking for summaries instead of full reports. Scott Baines requesting copies of our corporate governance documents without involving legal operations. Small movements. Quiet ones. But enough to change the air. So, I did what they never imagined I would do. I said nothing. Instead, I spent the next 48 hours building a private record. I exported system logs. I saved email headers. I copied approval chains. I forwarded material to an encrypted folder Miriam's office controlled. I asked our external IT consultant, Owen Kessler, to review access anomalies under the pretext of a cyber risk assessment for an incoming client. Owen had worked with us on 2 hotel acquisitions and, more importantly, he disliked Daniel on site. Later, he told me Daniel had that particular kind of confidence that made competent people protective of their servers. A week later, the second anomaly landed. 2 payments, both just under the internal flag threshold, were routed from a project reserve account to an entity called Keen Creative Advisory. The invoice descriptions were vague enough to pass first review: brand modernization, market narrative consulting, launch strategy. We did use brand consultants. We did pay retainers. But never from project reserves, and never to a brand new LLC created 6 weeks earlier by a woman named Chloe Mercer using a registered agent in Delaware. At first, I assumed Daniel had found a new way to expense a girlfriend. Then I saw the memo line. Hawthorne transition. That was when I called Miriam. Her office sat on the 22nd floor of a limestone building off Rittenhouse Square, all smoked glass, dark wood shelving, and the soft amber light of people who build by the hour, and one often enough not to rush. She wore a charcoal suit, no visible jewelry except a thin gold watch, and listened without interrupting while I laid out the invoices, the access logs, the odd valuation requests, and the sudden family interest in trust documents they had ignored for years. When I finished, she tapped one fingernail once against the folder and asked, "Do you want to salvage the relationship or survive the ambush?" I looked at her. "That's not a dramatic question," she said. "It's strategic. They're either making a mess because they're disorganized, or they're building a record because they intend to move you out. If it's the second one, confronting them early only teaches them where their gaps are." I thought about Daniel's office desktop, about my mother's new interest in estate planning, about my father's silence, about the way women in my family were praised for endurance, right up until they became inconvenient. "Survive the ambush," I said. Miriam nodded once. "Then we let them feel safe." That became our method. I kept going to work. I kept taking the meetings, running the operations calls, and cleaning up Daniel's mistakes with clients who still preferred to email me directly because they wanted answers in complete sentences. At dinner, I listened when my mother mentioned future structure and legacy positioning. I let my father ask vague questions about profitability while never once mentioning the cash transfers I was tracking. I even attended a Sunday brunch at Hawthorne House, where Daniel spent 20 minutes telling everyone about his vision for modernizing the company, while crumbs clung to the corner of his mouth and my Aunt Evelyn nodded, as if she were watching Churchill Reborn. I smiled. I poured coffee. I learned. That is the thing people like Daniel never understand. They think silence means surrender because they only go quiet when they've run out of weapons. My silence was a filing system. 2 weeks after I hired Miriam, we found the first real fracture in their plan. Owen finished tracing the login anomalies and discovered that someone had requested temporary elevation privileges through our internal admin console using my name. The request was approved by Melissa Grant in HR and routed, unusually, to Daniel for executive continuity review. Melissa claimed later that she thought it was part of an access cleanup. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. What mattered was that Daniel now had a documented path to use my credentials with enough deniability to stage transactions. Then there was the matter of Hawthorne House. The property wasn't simply a family home. It had been folded years earlier into a collateral package tied to a revolving credit facility we used during the Mason Harbor expansion. That meant no transfer could legally occur without lender notification and board acknowledgement. If my parents tried to hand it to Daniel quietly, they would trigger a covenant problem big enough to bring outside scrutiny fast. Miriam smiled for the first time when she saw that file. "So they're not just ungrateful," she said.
They're sloppy.
The third revelation arrived by accident. Or maybe not by accident. I still don't know. It came in the form of a text sent to me one rainy Thursday evening while I was in the carriage house apartment, sitting at the old oak desk beneath a brass lamp, listening to water tick against the window panes. The message came from an unknown number. "He told me you'd be the one blamed." That was it. No greeting. No name. I stared at it for a long moment, then replied, "Who is this?" 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Reappeared. Someone who would rather not go down with him. 5 minutes later, another message came through. This one was a screenshot. Daniel's contact card at the top. Under it, a thread of messages to the sender. "Need you to hold the invoices if Elena asks. Dad says she'll be out before quarter close. Delete the drafts after Scott sees the package." I looked at the rain on the window and felt the shape of the story change. Miriam had me send only one response.
"Call me tomorrow at 9.
Use FaceTime. Do not forward anything else." The woman who called the next morning was Chloe Mercer. She was younger than I expected, maybe 28, with blunt-cut dark hair, a white robe collar visible at her throat, and the exhausted face of someone who had not slept because reality had arrived in pieces overnight. Behind her, I could see the marble backsplash of a condo kitchen and a bowl of oranges arranged so carefully it made the whole scene feel lonelier. "I know what this looks like," she said before I could speak. "It looks like you have information," Miriam said from the chair beside me. Chloe's eyes flicked to Miriam, then back to me. "Daniel said you were unstable." I smiled faintly. "Did he?" "He said you'd been making mistakes. That he was trying to protect the company from you. He hired me to do branding work first. Then investor decks. Then he asked me to create invoices for projects that didn't exist yet because he wanted, quote, flexibility. What changed? Miriam asked. Chloe swallowed. He sent me a draft email last night, an indemnity letter, basically saying if anything came out, I had acted independently. He said he'd take care of me after it cooled off. In other words, I said, he planned to bury you. She gave a tiny nod. Over the next hour, Chloe shared documents, draft invoices, voice notes, calendar invites, photos of signed checks Daniel had left on her kitchen counter after too many bourbons, and a late-night performance about how nobody respected his genius. In one voice note, recorded accidentally while his phone was in his jacket pocket, my mother's voice floated through the background saying, "Once Elena is out, it all becomes much cleaner." My father said nothing. The silence was its own signature. The evidence stacked fast after that. A metadata review showed the PDFs used to accuse me were compiled the morning of the boardroom ambush, not over time as a genuine concern package would have been. Security logs from the office garage placed Daniel in the building late on nights connected to the transfers. The so-called staff statements Melissa referenced turned out to be vague internal interview summaries prompted by Daniel's loaded questions. And perhaps my favorite detail of all, the severance agreement they planned to force on me included a clause requiring me to waive claims related to asset distribution I had not yet been informed about, which meant Scott had drafted it before the family meeting was ever scheduled. Premeditation has a paper smell. Toner, staples, fresh ink. Once you know it, you never confuse it with panic again. So when they called me into that boardroom and tried to bury me under neat stacks of printed accusation, I already knew where every page came from. That was why I drank water. That was why I told them not to delete anything. And that was why, when I walked into Miriam's office after the ambush, I wasn't shaking. I was done waiting. Miriam's conference room overlooked the square, where late-morning sunlight struck the tops of the sycamores and turned the traffic below into moving shards of color. The table was black glass. The chairs were pale leather. Everything in the room looked expensive enough to discourage dishonesty. Owen was already there with 2 laptops open and 3 bankers' boxes lying beside him. Each box had a white label in block letters. Access logs. Transfers. Trust and governance. He glanced up as I entered. How theatrical were they? Enough to be useful, I said. Miriam handed me a cup of coffee in a matte ceramic mug. Then let's be more theatrical. For the next 3 hours, we assembled the sequence that would break them. First, we sent preservation notices. 1 to the company. 1 to Scott Baines's office. 1 to my parents personally. 1 to Daniel.
Short.
Surgical. Preserve all records related to access credentials, account transfers, trust amendments, property conveyance, employment actions, and communications concerning Elena Marlowe. Failure to preserve may constitute spoliation. Then Miriam called the lender tied to the Hawthorne collateral package and asked a very precise question about whether a property transfer had been disclosed. It had not. Then Owen forwarded his preliminary forensic summary to a contact at our cyber insurance carrier, because if internal credentials were used fraudulently, the company itself had reporting obligations whether my family liked it or not. By 1:30 that afternoon, Daniel was calling me every 6 minutes. I watched his name light my phone screen and disappear, light and disappear, like a buoy bobbing in black water. I did not answer. My mother texted first. Please stop this before it gets ugly. Then my father.
Come home.
We can discuss privately. I archived both. At 2:14, Daniel sent a voice memo. I listened to it once. His breathing was uneven, words tripping over each other. What did you do? Miriam Vale contacted Scott, and now the bank is asking questions. If this is your way of, if you think you can embarrass the family into, Elena, call me right now. Embarrass the family. That was always the true offense. Not fraud. Not theft. Exposure. Miriam arranged the formal meeting for the following Tuesday at 9 a.m. in the Central Conference Suite of Braddock and Vale, with notice that absent cooperation we were prepared to seek emergency relief related to the unlawful employment action, attempted fraudulent transfer of collateralized property, breach of fiduciary duty, and defamation. Formal enough to terrify them. controlled enough to keep them talking. Scott accepted within 40 minutes. That evening, I went back to the carriage house one last time. The little apartment sat behind Hawthorne House above the old three-car garage, with leaded windows, creaking pine floors, and a kitchen no wider than a hallway. Golden sunset pooled through the curtains and lit the dust in the air. I had moved in there at 27 during the Fairfield project because I was working too many late nights to justify the commute. My mother used to call it your useful little nest, which told you everything about how my usefulness had always softened my trespass in their minds. I packed quietly, not because I had to be out by Friday. I already knew that severance demand would never stand, but because I wanted the emotional geometry clear. I was leaving as a choice, not an exile. I wrapped dishes in newspaper. I folded sweaters into boxes. I took the framed photograph of my grandfather from the bookshelf and slipped it into my tote. In the photo, he was standing in front of the first hotel he ever restored, sleeves rolled, tie loose, smile rare and real. He had taught me how to read contracts and how to spot rotten joists with a hammer tap. He also taught me that people tell you who they are in the order they value things. Money first, image second, loyalty last. By 9 o'clock, I had packed everything that mattered. At 9:13, my phone buzzed again. It was Chloe. I answered. I just got a call from Daniel, she said. Her voice was low, controlled now, stronger than before. He wants me to say, I acted alone. He said if I keep my story clean, he'll protect me. Will he? She gave a humorless laugh. He also accidentally called me Vanessa halfway through the conversation. I leaned against the old pine counter and looked out at the dark outline of the garden below. Are you still with him?
No.
Are you sure?
A beat.
Then, he doesn't know I've moved half my things out. That made me smile despite myself. Good. She exhaled. I'm not doing this for you. Just so we're clear. I wouldn't trust you if you said you were. Another small laugh. Warmer this time. I'm doing it, she said, because men like Daniel always think the women in the room are furniture until they need somewhere to hide their mistakes. There it was. The first clean piece of truth between us. Then come Tuesday, I said. Bring everything. By Monday, the panic had spread through my family like dye dropped in water. My Aunt Evelyn left a voicemail about legacy. Melissa emailed to ask whether there was any path toward mutual de-escalation. Scott sent a clipped note objecting to the tone of Miriam's preservation demands, which is how lawyers say we know we're in trouble and resent you for being specific. My father attempted silence one last time, but even that failed when the lender requested documentation for the unreported Hawthorne transfer and our outside auditor asked why there had been unusual after-hours admin access tied to executive credentials. Daniel kept calling. At 11:40 on Monday night, he showed up outside the carriage house. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel first, then the slam of a car door. The porch light cast a weak yellow cone across the flagstones. When I opened the inner door but kept the screen latched, he was standing there with his suit jacket thrown over one shoulder and his tie pulled loose, face flushed from anger or drink or both. Open the door.
No.
His laugh came out short and disbelieving. You've made your point. I haven't started making my point. He gripped the porch railing. White knuckles again. Always the hands first with Daniel. Mom is beside herself. Dad's blood pressure is through the roof. Scott says you're creating exposure that could destroy the company. The company was exposed when you used my credentials. I did what I had to do. That surprised me. Not because he said it.
Because he said it that fast.
For what? I asked evenly. To fix what you were doing. And what was I doing? He opened his mouth.
Closed it.
Looked away toward the dark garden. You were positioning yourself. There it was. The child's grievance at the center of the grown man's fraud. I rested one hand on the old brass doorknob and waited. He stepped closer to the screen. You think you're smarter than everyone. You always have. Grandpa treated you like some kind of prodigy, and Dad let you run operations like the rest of us were interns in your little empire. The rest of us, I repeated. Meaning you. Meaning this family. No, I said quietly. Just you. He looked at me with the same expression he wore when we were teenagers and I'd beat him at chess after he'd spent the entire game narrating his future victory. Shock first, then resentment, then the frantic search for a rule that would protect him from consequence. "You could still stop this," he said. "Miriam wants a spectacle. Don't give it to her." "I'm not." "Then why are you doing this?" "Because you accused me of the crimes you committed," I said. "Because Mom and Dad handed you assets they had no right to transfer. Because you mistook dependence for power. Choose whichever reason helps you sleep." He stared at me through the screen mesh, face pale, under the porch light. I let the silence settle over him. Finally, he said, "You always did know how to make people feel small." "No," I said. "I just stopped helping you feel big." Then I closed the inner door and turned the deadbolt. They thought they still had room to negotiate. They thought Tuesday would be a family argument with legal stationery. They had no idea it had already become a reckoning. Tuesday morning broke cold and clear. By 8:30, the city was washed in sharp autumn light, the kind that makes every pane of glass and polished surface look overly honest. Braddock and Vale's conference suite smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and lemon oil. The reception floors were veined marble. The doors to Conference A were dark walnut with brushed brass handles so heavy they made entering feel ceremonial. I arrived 10 minutes early wearing a charcoal dress, black coat, and the pearl studs my grandfather bought me when I finished business school. Nothing dramatic. Nothing soft. Miriam was already inside arranging binders into exact lines across the table. Owen had connected a display screen at one end of the room. Beside each place setting sat a legal pad, a glass water carafe, and a narrow folder tabbed in red. Professional intimidation is most effective when it looks tidy. "You look rested," Miriam said. "I slept well."
Good.
They didn't. At 8:54, Scott Baines arrived first. His suit was immaculate, but his mouth had the drawn look of a man who had spent 12 hours explaining obvious law to clients who preferred delusion. He nodded stiffly at me, then took the seat opposite Miriam and began arranging his papers with excessive care. At 8:57, my father walked in with my mother beside him and Daniel 2 steps behind. I almost didn't recognize the collective shape of them. They had all shrunk. My father's usually perfect shoulders were rounded, his tie slightly off-center, his eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. My mother's cream coat hung open over a navy dress, but the elegance couldn't hide the speed with which her gaze swept the room, clocking exits, binders, screen, allies. Daniel had shaved too fast. There was a faint nick near his jawline. He carried his anger, now the way men carry an injury they refuse to treat, carefully, but with pride. Melissa Grant came in last, clutching her handbag with both hands. No one sat until Miriam gestured. "Thank you for coming," she said. Daniel gave a hard laugh. "As if we had a choice." Miriam didn't look at him. "You did. It would simply have been a worse one." The room settled. Glass reflected morning light. A heating vent breathed softly overhead. Outside the window, one of the square's fountains flashed silver in the sun. Miriam began. "This meeting concerns 4 interrelated issues: the attempted wrongful termination of Elena Marlowe, the fabrication of evidence purporting to implicate her in unauthorized financial transfers, the improper and undisclosed transfer of Hawthorne House in violation of lender covenants and governance obligations, and a broader pattern of self-dealing involving Marlowe Hospitality Restoration Group." My mother stiffened at the full company name, as if hearing the business called something formal instead of family made the whole thing more dangerous. Scott raised a hand slightly. "We reject the characterization of." "You can reject it after you hear it," Miriam said. Then she nodded to Owen. He stood, clicked the remote, and the first timeline appeared on the wall screen. White background, black text, blue date markers. Clean enough to belong in a board presentation. Damning enough to change lives. August 11th. Temporary privilege request initiated in Elena Marlowe's name. August 11th, 8:14 p.m. Request approved through HR route. August 11th, 8:19 p.m. Continuity review acknowledgement from Daniel Marlowe. August 12th, 11:47 p.m. Unauthorized vendor approval executed using Elena credentials from device assigned to Daniel Marlowe. August 29th. First transfer to Keen Creative Advisory. September 3rd. Valuation request for Hawthorne House tied to Trust Amendment draft. September 16th. Second transfer to Keen Creative Advisory and Reserve Account reclassification. September 27th. Severance agreement drafted including preemptive waiver related to undisclosed asset distribution. October 3rd, 10 a.m. Boardroom accusation and termination attempt. The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel looked at the screen the way people look at a medical scan that has suddenly become personal. My mother's lips parted. Melissa sank back in her chair as if the leather had given way beneath her. My father removed his glasses, wiped them, put them back on, and still somehow managed not to look at me. Scott spoke first, voice tight. Where did you obtain internal routing data? Owen replied without inflection. From your client's own system records, preserved before anyone had the good sense to destroy them. Daniel turned to Melissa. You said those wouldn't.
He stopped.
Miriam's eyes flicked to him. Please continue, Mr. Marlowe. No, Scott said sharply. Nobody says another word until... Until what? Miriam asked. Until we discuss the audio? That got everyone's attention. She opened the first red-tabbed binder, withdrew a transcript, and slid copies across the table with 2 fingers. I watched each one react differently. My mother read fast, then slower, as if rereading might produce mercy. My father stopped halfway and closed his eyes. Melissa didn't touch hers. Daniel skimmed 3 lines and looked up, all color draining from his face. It's edited, he said. Chloe's voice came from the doorway behind him. No, she said. It isn't. Every head turned. She stepped into the room wearing a black coat over a dove-gray blouse, hair pulled back, expression composed. Not ashamed. Not dramatic. Just done. In one hand, she carried a leather folder. In the other, her phone. For the first time since I had known him, Daniel looked truly unprepared. Chloe, he said, and his voice cracked on the second syllable. She didn't answer him. She took the empty seat beside Owen, set down the folder, and looked at Scott. I'm here with independent counsel on standby, she said. I've provided copies of the original files, the message chain, draft invoices, voice notes, and the indemnity email Daniel sent me asking me to assume sole responsibility if questions arose. My mother stared at her. You were involved in this. Chloe met her gaze, without blinking. I was used in this. There's a difference. Daniel leaned forward, palms flat against the table. You don't understand what you're doing. She almost smiled. That's what you always say right before a woman stops helping you. There are moments when a room changes ownership. You can feel it even before anyone names it. The rhythm alters. The oxygen belongs to somebody else. I uncapped my pen, drew one quiet line under the date at the top of my notepad, and said, Actually, Daniel, you are committing fraud. No one interrupted me. I continued in the same tone I might have used to correct a typo. You used my credentials to create a record you thought would support removal. You moved funds through an entity connected to someone you assumed would stay loyal because you confused attention with leverage. You attempted to transfer a collateralized family property without disclosure. And you drafted an employment exit designed to waive claims to assets I had not yet been told were being redistributed. Daniel's mouth opened.
Closed.
I turned slightly toward Scott. If you'd like, I can slow down. Scott's face had gone gray at the edges. Elena, if there has been a misunderstanding. I let out a small breath that might have been a laugh. A misunderstanding requires 2 honest parties. Miriam slid another document across the table. Exhibit 14. Metadata summary for the accusation packet presented to Ms. Marlowe. Compilation date: the morning of the ambush. Source files accessed from Daniel Marlowe's office workstation and a shared legal review folder associated with Scott Baines. Scott didn't touch it. Melissa finally spoke, voice thin. I thought this was an internal inquiry. Owen turned to her. Internal inquiries rarely begin with forged evidence and end with real estate conveyance. My father braced both hands on the table and asked the first useful question he'd asked in months. What do you want? It landed in the middle of the room with surprising weight. Not denial. Not outrage. Just the stripped-down language of a man finally recognizing that the terms are no longer his. Miriam answered, but she looked at all of them when she did. We want immediate written rescission of Elena Marlowe's purported termination. We want the Hawthorne House transfer halted and reversed pending lender review. We want Daniel Marlowe's resignation from operational authority, pending a full forensic accounting. We want production of all trust amendments, side agreements, device access logs, and communications related to asset redistribution. We want correction of defamatory allegations made internally and externally. We want reimbursement of Elena's legal fees and compensation for damages. And we want cooperation. Full cooperation. Today. My mother gave a tiny, incredulous shake of her head. You're tearing this family apart over paperwork. I looked at her then, really looked at her. The beautifully set hair. The pearl bracelet. The spine held rigid as a column. All that elegance wrapped around a sentence so dishonest it almost admired itself. No, I said quietly. I'm just refusing to stand under the pieces while it falls. Daniel pushed back from the table so hard his chair struck the credenza behind him. This is unbelievable. Chloe, you were with me. You knew what the plan was. Yes, she said. That's why I knew you'd eventually blame me. He turned on Scott. Do something. Scott snapped. I am trying to keep you from speaking yourself into criminal exposure. That landed. My mother looked at Scott, then Daniel, then my father. Criminal. No one answered her, which was answer enough. Miriam nodded to Owen again. The next slide appeared. This one was not a simple timeline. It was a flow chart. Entities, accounts, arrows. Reserve accounts feeding into Keen Creative. Personal reimbursements routed through event budgets. A trust amendment timed against the valuation request for Hawthorne House. Side notes showing which approvals were manual, which were anomalous, and which originated from devices Daniel controlled. Owen pointed one item out after another with the end of a capped pen. Here, reserve funds were reclassified under a project deliverables code usually limited to site emergencies. Here, a marketing invoice was paid from a restricted account inconsistent with ordinary practice. Here, draft trust language anticipates Elena's separation from the company before that separation was ever discussed with her. Here, the accusation packet references payments not yet visible in the quarterly reporting dashboards available to most staff, meaning someone with executive access assembled it intentionally. List by list, date by date. Nothing rushed. That was the beauty of it. We were not trying to overwhelm them. We were inviting them to watch their own design become visible. My father lowered himself back into his chair like a man sitting under unexpected age. Patricia, he said, not taking his eyes off the papers, what exactly did you sign? My mother looked at him, stunned. Excuse me, what did you sign? I signed what Scott prepared for estate alignment. Scott straightened. To be clear, I prepared drafts based on information provided by your family. I did not advise any fraudulent conduct. Miriam's expression didn't change. Then you will have no issue producing version history. Scott said nothing. Daniel dragged a hand over his face. This was supposed to be clean. I rested my hands on the table. That's the problem with using other people as your cleanup crew. They tend to leave fingerprints. He looked at me with hatred so raw, it almost felt adolescent. You set me up. No, I said. I made sure you'd find exactly what I wanted you to find. The words landed harder than I expected. My mother stared at me. My father finally did too. Melissa actually whispered, "Oh my God." I continued before anyone could reclaim the air. The first false invoice was your test, Daniel. You wanted to see whether I'd react. I didn't. After that, you got ambitious. You moved money in smaller amounts, used a girlfriend you assumed you controlled, looped in HR to formalize access, and let mom and dad believe the transition would look like discipline instead of theft. I watched because I needed the whole map, not one stolen brick. Daniel laughed once, but there was no humor in it now. So, what? You let it happen. I let you reveal yourselves. My mother's voice dropped to a hiss. You're enjoying this. That almost hurt because it told me she still didn't know me at all. No, I said. I'm ending it. The meeting broke apart after that, the way glass breaks under pressure. First a crack, then too many edges to count. My mother turned on Daniel. You told us the consultants were legitimate. Daniel shot back. They were until she started playing both sides. Chloe laughed softly. Next time, make sure they're not working for both sides. My father rounded on Scott. You told me the transfer could be handled discreetly. Scott snapped. I told you it required careful sequencing and complete disclosure, neither of which I was given. Melissa began crying in the quiet, miserable way people cry when they realize they were not important enough to be protected. At one point, Daniel actually stood and said, I want my own lawyer. Miriam replied, that would be wise. Then my mother did something I will never forget. She turned to me, ignoring everyone else in the room, and said, after everything we gave you. The room went very still. There are sentences that summarize whole childhoods. That was one of mine. I looked at her for a long moment and saw not a villain, exactly, but a woman who had spent her life treating love as a budget line. Limited.
Strategic.
Best invested in the child who mirrored her need for importance. Daniel was appetite and charm and theater. I was competence. Useful. Dependable. Easier to deny because I asked for so little. I built your systems, I said. I salvaged your vendor relationships. I negotiated the Mason Harbor extension after Daniel nearly lost it. I managed payroll during the Lennox shortfall so staff didn't miss Christmas. I turned down 3 outside offers because Dad asked me to stay loyal to the business. If that still reads to you as what you gave me, then we are finally speaking honestly. Her face changed then. Not enough to become remorse, but enough to show she felt the cut. Miriam slid the settlement framework into the center of the table. The pages made a dry whisper against the wood. You have 2 options. Cooperate with a structured civil resolution and complete disclosure process, or we proceed with lender notification, claims filings, and referral packages. Given the evidence already preserved, I would advise choosing the option that leaves you with the most dignity. Scott reached for the papers first.
He read.
Turned pages. Read again. Then he leaned back and removed his glasses. What's in the referral package? He asked. Miriam held his gaze. Enough. That was when my father folded. Not dramatically. No shouting. No confession. He just looked at the city through the window for several seconds, then back at the documents and said, Daniel, resign. Daniel jerked toward him. Dad. Resign. This is because she got to you. My father's expression hardened in a way I had not seen since I was a child.
No.
This is because you thought a family business was a stage for your insecurity. Daniel looked genuinely stricken, as if of all the consequences on the table, paternal clarity was the one he had never prepared for. My mother whispered, Richard. He didn't look at her. Patricia, stop. Scott began marking up the framework. One revision, then another. Miriam accepted some, rejected others. We moved line by line through restitution, governance review, disclosure obligations, non-disparagement, and suspension of control. Chloe's counsel joined briefly by speakerphone to confirm cooperation terms. Melissa was directed to preserve all HR records and would later resign. Daniel signed a standstill agreement pending deeper review. The Hawthorne transfer was halted. The severance demand was withdrawn. My shares remained mine. My officer title was restored for record purposes and then converted, at my request, into a compensated advisory separation pending a full buyout. Because I did not want the company back. That surprised them almost as much as the evidence. At one point, Scott looked up and said, You could take the whole thing if you press this. I know, I said. Daniel stared. Then why aren't you? I thought about the office under fluorescent light, the family dinners, the constant labor of being invaluable to people who resented having to admit it, the old instinct to win by staying, the newer wisdom of refusing contaminated prizes. Because I'm not cleaning up after you for another decade, I said evenly. The signing took place just after 1 in the afternoon. Pens moved. Pages turned. Initials appeared in blue ink beside clauses my family had never imagined would one day exist between us. My mother's hand shook only once on the restitution schedule. Daniel signed too hard and tore one corner slightly. Melissa signed like a woman at the DMV, stunned by procedure. Scott signed as witness and looked 20 years older. When it was done, Miriam stacked the executed copies into neat piles and said, "Our office will circulate the final preserved set by 5. We strongly recommend that no one contact Ms. Marlowe directly except through counsel for the next 72 hours." I stood, buttoned my coat, and gathered my notebook. Daniel was still seated, staring at the signed pages as if staring might unmake them. My father looked hollowed out. My mother had gone very still, the stillness of expensive porcelain moments before it cracks. As I reached the door, my mother said my name. I turned. There was a whole audience inside that single second. My childhood. Her expectations. All the years I confused endurance with peace. "She's family," my mother said, as if explaining me to the room, or perhaps to herself. I considered that. Then I looked at the documents on the table, at Daniel's bent head, at the polished walnut door under my hand. "You were right about one thing," I said quietly. "These things should stay in the family." Then I left them there with every secret finally in the correct room. The next few weeks were quieter than I expected. Not emotionally. Logistically. There were accountants, disclosure schedules, valuation meetings, controlled communications through lawyers drafted in language so polished it almost disguised the blood underneath. But beneath all that process, something simpler was happening. My family was losing the ability to narrate me. That alone was worth half the fight. 6 weeks later, I woke in a loft apartment in Society Hill with pale winter sunlight spilling across wide plank floors and the smell of coffee filling a kitchen that belonged only to me. The windows were steel-framed and faced east, so mornings came in clean and bright. My favorite mug sat warm between my hands. There was a wool throw over the arm of the sofa, a stack of proposal drafts on the dining table, and no one in the world expecting me to perform gratitude before breakfast. Fresh starts don't usually arrive trumpeting. They arrive with ordinary pleasures you once had to earn. I had taken the buyout, the fee reimbursement, and the consulting contacts I'd built over 10 years of doing the hard work in rooms where men like Daniel preferred speeches. 3 months after the Braddock and Vale meeting, I launched Marlowe Advisory Group under a different registered name first, then my own when I realized I no longer flinched at it. Governance audits. Crisis restructuring. Succession planning for family-owned hospitality and real estate businesses run by people one betrayal away from collapse. It turned out there was an enormous market for helping companies survive the kinds of secrets families insist on calling personality. And I was very good at it. Jonah Reeves, our former operations director, joined me first. He had stayed silent during the boardroom ambush because Daniel outranked him on paper and because silence inside toxic systems is often just fear wearing office clothes. But 2 days after the formal meeting, he called and said, "If you build something, I'd rather work somewhere competence isn't treated like a threat." I hired him before lunch. Miriam sent referrals. Owen sent cybersecurity reviews. One hotel owner in Baltimore hired us after hearing, through channels polite people pretend not to have, that I had prevented a family implosion from becoming a criminal case. By spring, we had 6 retained clients and a waiting list. Meanwhile, karma got organized. Daniel lost the CEO title immediately and the board seat soon after. The forensic review uncovered additional personal spending routed through business accounts, including travel, entertainment, and what an auditor described dryly as non-operational companion-related expenditures. Which remains the most elegant phrase I have ever heard for mistress money. His name circulated quietly through the hotel and restoration circuit, and suddenly the people who once found him charming began finding him risky. The last update I heard was that he tried to launch a boutique investment venture out of a shared office suite in King of Prussia and spent more time chasing introductions than closing anything. For a man who had always needed an audience, obscurity hit like a disease. My mother's consequences were social, which for her were almost theological. She stepped down from the Fairmont Preservation Gala Committee after 2 other board women learned enough to stop inviting her to strategy lunches. The women she once seated according to donor value now seated her near the exits. She kept the clothes, the jewelry, the perfect blowouts. But status is a chandelier. Once it falls, everyone remembers the crash longer than the light. My father retired earlier than planned. Officially, it was for health and long-deferred peace. Unofficially, lenders and outside advisors had lost confidence in his oversight, which is a polite way of saying no one wanted a man in charge who had mistaken avoidance for leadership. He sold his club membership. He stopped appearing at industry events. The last time someone mentioned seeing him, he was in the back pew of St. Catherine's at a weekday service, staring at the floor. Melissa resigned from HR before the quarter ended. I heard she took a compliance role at a medical billing firm in Cherry Hill, a position with less prestige and more process, which honestly may have saved her. Enablers sometimes improve when stripped of glamour. Scott Baines kept his license, but not his old sheen. Lawyers survive scandal better than most, yet even he could not fully outrun the whisper that he had helped structure a family ambush without asking enough inconvenient questions. He began speaking in public about governance ethics 6 months later, which I found almost touching in its transparency. As for Chloe, the market had been crueler to her at first because women connected to men's fraud always get asked whether they should have known, while men connected to women's fraud somehow remain tragic. But she had come into the meeting with original files, complete cooperation, and a willingness to speak without self-pity. That mattered. She eventually started freelancing under her own name instead of the LLC Daniel had used as camouflage, and slowly the work came back. My phone lit up often during those months. Some messages were angry. Daniel, you ruined everything. Daniel, 3 days later. I hope you're happy. Daniel, 2 weeks later at 1:12 a.m. We could have fixed this privately. Some were nostalgic. My mother. Hawthorne doesn't feel the same. My mother. I passed the carriage house and thought of you. My mother. I miss who we were before all this. That one almost made me laugh. Before all this. As if betrayal begins only when it becomes visible. My father left voicemails instead. Slow, hesitant, formal even in grief. I'm not sure what to say. I know I failed you. If you ever want to sit down, no agenda. I listened to each message once, saved them to an archive folder, and did not respond. That was one of the strangest parts of recovery. Realizing closure is not a conversation. It is a boundary that stops asking for witness. One bright Saturday in April, I was at a cafe on Pine Street with Jonah, sunlight turning the cafe's green tile backsplash almost luminous, when he came back from the counter with 2 coffees and a look of delighted disbelief. You won't believe who I just saw, he said, sliding into the bentwood chair across from me. I raised an eyebrow. Daniel. Outside. In a suit that looked borrowed. Borrowed from whom? Someone shorter. I laughed. Jonah wrapped both hands around his cup. He was trying to pitch a hospitality startup founder at the corner table. The founder left after 5 minutes. Daniel stayed and called somebody named Wes 3 times in a row. Poor Wes. Jonah grinned. That's not the best part. He asked if I was free to talk. I said I was late for a meeting. You were. I know. With you. Which made it delicious. There was no venom in moments like that anymore. Just the clean, almost academic satisfaction of consequences arriving on schedule. By summer, Hawthorne House had been sold. That detail surprises people when they hear the story, as if they assume I must have fought to reclaim it. But houses can become shrines to bad mathematics. Too much memory. Too much maintenance. Too many inherited lies trapped in stone. The sale paid down obligations, resolved the lender pressure, and closed one more door my mother had tried to use as a weapon. On the day the sale closed, I drove out once more to collect the last of my grandfather's books from the library. The afternoon light fell gold across the old limestone facade. Inside, the banister still gleamed from decades of polish, and the foyer smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Empty houses always sound larger, like they're relieved of performance. My mother was there when I arrived. She stood in the library by the window, one hand resting on the back of a leather chair. For a second, seeing her in that room under the muted sunlight, with shelves half bare and the Persian rug rolled at one end, I felt the old pull of filial pity. Then I remembered the brass keys across the walnut table. "I thought you'd come earlier," she said. "I had work." "Of course you did." There was no insult in it this time. Just history. I crossed to the shelves and began boxing the books I wanted. Hospitality law, estate architecture, an old volume on restoration ethics annotated in my grandfather's cramped hand. My mother watched. Finally, she said, "I never thought it would go this far." I slid another book into the box. "That's because none of you thought I would object in a way you couldn't manage." She looked down at the leather chair, smoothing the seam with 2 fingers. "It wasn't only about Daniel." "No," I said. "It never is. People like you always tell themselves it's about peace." Her chin lifted slightly. "And people like you." I waited. "People like you," she said more quietly, "make everyone else feel as though they're being measured." That was honest enough to matter. I closed the box lid and rested my hands on it. "I was measuring whether I was loved in proportion to my usefulness," I said. I got my answer. She closed her eyes for one brief second. When she opened them, they were wet, though she would never have called it crying. "I did love you." I believed she believed that. But belief and capacity are not the same thing. "I know," I said. "You just loved me in a way that always left room to sacrifice me." I lifted the box. She moved aside. Neither of us hugged. Neither of us apologized. The library light dimmed as a cloud passed over the sun, and for the first time in my life, leaving that house felt lighter than entering it ever had. The months after that became less about surviving the betrayal and more about recognizing what it had taught me to do. I had always been good in crisis. What changed was my understanding of value. In my family, value was granted conditionally, like a temporary title. In my own life, I started treating it as intrinsic, fixed, immune to negotiation. That shift touched everything. My work got sharper. My friendships got cleaner. My apartment filled not with expensive things, but with chosen ones: a velvet chair in rust orange, heavy linen curtains, a dining table made from reclaimed ash, a set of blue glasses I bought simply because I liked the way they caught light at sunset. I became close with people I might once have dismissed as temporary. Jonah, who had a dry wit and an unexpected talent for coaxing terrified clients into honesty. Miriam, who occasionally let herself be funny after a second glass of wine. And Chloe, perhaps strangest of all. The first time she and I met without lawyers involved was at a rooftop bar in Fishtown on a warm June evening. The deck boards were sun-faded cedar. Edison bulbs hung overhead. The skyline beyond the river glowed in bands of peach and copper as the city eased itself toward night. She arrived in wide-leg cream trousers and carried herself with the careful poise of someone still learning where shame ends and self-respect begins. "This is weird," she said, taking the seat opposite me. "It would be stranger if it felt natural." She laughed. Real laughter this time. Fair. We ordered spritzes and watched the light move across the glass railings. For a while we talked about work, then clients, then the quiet absurdities of being women-men like Daniel misread in opposite directions. I told her how he used to call me intense anytime I refused to indulge one of his improvisations. She told me he once described her as easy to manage because she remembered birthdays and could make investors feel interesting. We sat with that for a moment. Then Chloe lifted her glass. "To disappointing men with lazy imaginations." I touched my glass to hers. "To surviving them." By the end of that evening, something unexpected had formed between us. Not friendship exactly.
Not yet.
But recognition. A thin, clean bridge built from shared clarity. Over time, it became more. She referred design clients to my firm when their family structures looked unstable. I sent her branding work when my clients needed someone who could see right behind polished messaging. Once, when a particularly arrogant restaurateur told her she was too emotional after she flagged obvious contract exposure, she called me from the sidewalk laughing so hard she could barely speak. Congratulations, I told her. You've been promoted to competent woman. She groaned. Do we get jackets? Only after 10 years and a breakdown. That was the thing I never saw coming. Not the win. The warmth after it. A year after the boardroom ambush, on an early September evening, I stood on my apartment balcony with the city spreading out below me in plains of gold and shadow. The sunset had turned the brick facades across the street amber. Farther off, the tops of towers caught the last orange glow like banked fire. Somewhere below, somebody laughed. A siren passed in the distance, softened by height. Inside, low music moved through the apartment and candlelight flickered against the glass front cabinet by the dining table. Chloe was in the kitchen opening a bottle of champagne. Jonah was due in 20 minutes. Miriam had texted that she'd be late because a client had lied to her face, and she wanted the satisfaction of billing through the rage. It was an ordinary evening in the life I had built, and that ordinariness felt more luxurious than anything my family ever tried to buy with money. I rested my hands on the balcony rail and looked out at the city as dusk gathered. Once, I would have stood in a house like Hawthorne believing that permanence was something other people granted you. A title, a ring of keys, a place at the table. I know better now. I used to think strength meant staying calm enough to absorb damage gracefully. I thought dignity was proving I could survive neglect without becoming inconvenient. I thought loyalty meant making myself smaller so other people could keep calling themselves generous. Now I know composure is not submission. Silence is not consent. And loyalty that demands your disappearance is just polished betrayal. The balcony door slid open behind me. Warm indoor light spilled onto the stone tile. Chloe stepped out with 2 champagne flutes, handed me one, and leaned against the rail beside me. Below us, the first city lights began to prick through the deepening blue, one by one, like a skyline learning to breathe. You know, she said, watching the horizon. A year ago, I thought my life was over. So did I. She smiled. Awkward, considering. Very. We stood there in companionable silence. The glass was cool in my hand. The champagne caught the sunset and turned it pale gold. Across the river, windows blazed briefly before surrendering to evening. I saw Daniel last month, Chloe said finally. I glanced at her. Fundraiser in Ardmore. He pretended not to know me. I took a small sip. How devastating for you. Almost fatal. We both laughed, and the sound rose clean into the warm air. After a moment, she lifted her glass slightly. To better taste. I raised mine to meet it. Crystal touched crystal with a clear, bright note that seemed to hang above the balcony for a second before dissolving into the evening. To better boundaries, I said. As the sun slipped fully below the skyline and the orange glow thinned into violet, I thought about the woman I had been when this began.
Capable, yes. Disciplined.
Proud of how much I could carry without complaint. But still naive in one crucial way. I believed that if I loved people correctly, usefully, faithfully enough, they would eventually choose fairness over convenience. The woman I am now knows better and gentler. She knows some people would rather inherit your labor than acknowledge your worth. She knows family can be a place, a history, a debt, a wound, or a gift, and sometimes the holiest thing you can do is decide which one it will no longer be. She knows gratitude can coexist with refusal. She knows leaving can be the most honest form of staying loyal to yourself. And in a quiet, private part of me I never offer to the people who earned at least, I am grateful to them. To my mother and her brass keys. To Daniel and his forged invoices. To my father and his silence polished smooth as stone. They did not break me. They revealed the architecture I had outgrown. Inside, the front door opened and Jonah called, I brought the good olives, so somebody better be emotionally available. Chloe laughed and went to let him in. I stayed 1 second longer on the balcony, watching the city lights gather under the darkening sky like 1,000 small verdicts, and I let myself feel it fully. Not revenge. Not triumph. Something quieter and far more permanent. Relief with roots.
Peace with a spine.
Sometimes the best revenge isn't about hurting the people who tried to erase you. It's about building a life so solid their approval can no longer touch the foundation. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making them pay. It's about becoming someone who never again mistakes survival for love.